public dislike toward Jada Pinkett Smith didn't begin with a slap. It didn't even begin with infidelity discourse. It began much earlier in the quiet accumulation of moments where audiences felt emotionally manipulated, morally instructed, or publicly corrected by someone who never fully acknowledged the power imbalance between celebrity confession and public consumption. By the time the Oscars incident happened, the resentment was already formed. The slap didn't create it, it exposed it. Jada entered public consciousness as a talented actress with a grounded, cerebral energy that contrasted sharply with Hollywood's more performative personas. Early roles positioned her as serious, introspective, and thoughtful. But from the start, there was an undercurrent that would later define her relationship with the public. She spoke to audiences, not with them. Her interviews often carried a tone of instruction rather than connection. That tone didn't register as hostility at first. It registered as authority. The first significant fracture came from how Jada framed authenticity. She consistently positioned herself as someone committed to truth, healing, and growth. But that framing often came paired with public correction of others' behavior, values, or expectations. When celebrities speak about self-work, audiences listen. When celebrities speak as arbiters of moral clarity, audiences bristle. Over time, Jada's language drifted from reflective to prescriptive, and that shift mattered. Her relationship with Will Smith became the primary stage where this dynamic played out. Early on, the Smiths marketed their marriage as evolved, untraditional, and emotionally expansive. That positioning appealed to some and alienated others. The issue wasn't the relationship structure itself. It was the way it was communicated. Jada often spoke about marriage as if it were a philosophical framework others needed to catch up to, rather than a personal choice that didn't require explanation. The public began to feel like unwilling participants in a private experiment. Interviews framed discomfort as ignorance. Questions were answered with reframes rather than clarity. Audiences weren't just being informed about a relationship, they were being told how to interpret it. That's when frustration quietly set in. Then came Red Table Talk. The show fundamentally changed Jada's public role. It positioned her not just as a celebrity, but as a facilitator of vulnerability, both her own and others. In theory, it was a space for honest conversation. In practice, it placed Jada at the center of a confessional economy where deeply personal revelations were packaged, broadcast, and then recontextualized as lessons. The power imbalance was immediate. Jada controlled the framing, the edit, and the moral takeaway. Guests were often in positions of emotional exposure while Jada retained composure and authority. Viewers began to sense something transactional about the vulnerability on display. Pain felt curated. Accountability felt uneven. That perception intensified during the episode involving her relationship with August Alsina. When Jada described the situation as an entanglement, the phrase instantly entered cultural lexicon, not because it was evasive, but because it felt strategically abstract. Audiences didn't object to the relationship itself as much as they objected to the language used to describe it. The phrasing sounded less like honesty and more like rebranding. More damaging than the revelation was the dynamic of the conversation itself. Will Smith appeared visibly uncomfortable, yet emotionally restrained. Jada remained composed, articulate, and in control of the narrative. For many viewers, that imbalance was unsettling. The conversation felt less like mutual disclosure and more like a public processing session, where one person bore visible emotional cost while the other maintained philosophical distance. From that moment forward, Jada became associated not just with transparency, but with public emotional asymmetry. The audience felt they were watching Will absorb pain in real time, while Jada contextualized it as growth. Whether that interpretation was fair didn't matter. It was how it felt. And feeling drives perception. Subsequent interviews reinforced the divide. Jada continued to speak openly about dissatisfaction, struggle, and self-prioritization, often framing Will as a chapter rather than a partner. Again, the issue wasn't the honesty, it was the cumulative effect. Each disclosure repositioned Will as emotionally exposed and Jada as narratively protected. Over time, sympathy consolidated around him. By the time the Oscars arrived, audiences already viewed Jada as someone whose words carried consequences she didn't always visibly bear. When Chris Rock made a joke referencing her shaved head, reactions were split. Some viewed it as insensitive, others viewed it as mild. What unified the response was not the joke itself, but what happened next. Will Smith walked on stage and struck Chris Rock. In that moment, years of unresolved public emotion snapped into focus. The slap was shocking, but the reaction to it revealed something deeper. A large portion of the public didn't just blame Will. They blamed the dynamic they believed he was trapped in. And at the center of that belief sat Jada. Her reaction, or lack of visible reaction, became the final accelerant. She didn't immediately intervene. She didn't publicly de-escalate. She didn't offer a clarifying statement that shifted responsibility away from Will. Silence followed. In celebrity culture, silence is interpreted as intention. Whether that interpretation was fair is secondary to why it landed. Audiences already believed Jada benefited from emotional outcomes without absorbing fallout. The Oscars incident appeared to confirm that belief. Will's career stalled, his reputation fractured. Jada's remained largely intact. That imbalance hardened resentment into anger. Subsequent commentary didn't soften the reaction. When Jada spoke about the slap later, her language again emphasized growth, awakening, and larger lessons. For audiences, it sounded detached from the immediate harm done. People weren't looking for enlightenment. They were looking for accountability that matched the gravity of the moment. At its core, public resentment toward Jada Pinkett Smith is not about infidelity, unconventional marriage, or alopecia jokes. It's about perceived emotional extraction. The sense that others absorb consequences while she reframes outcomes as evolution. The sense that vulnerability flows toward her, while accountability flows around her. This perception may not reflect her internal reality, but public figures don't live solely in internal reality. They live in patterns. And the pattern audiences believe they see is one where Jada controls narrative space while others pay emotional cost. The Oscars slap crystallized that belief because it provided a physical manifestation of what had previously been emotional. Will acted, Will fell, Will apologized. Jada remained composed. In a culture that expects visible reciprocity, that imbalance was unforgivable. People don't hate Jada Pinkett Smith because she speaks her truth. They resent her because her truth is often delivered from a position of narrative safety, while others stand exposed beside her. They don't object to growth. They object to growth that appears insulated from consequence. The tragedy of this perception is that it leaves no room for nuance. Jada may be deeply introspective, principled, and sincere, but sincerity doesn't negate impact. And impact, once felt, doesn't require proof. By the time the Oscars ended, the story was already written. The slap wasn't a beginning, it was an ending. A moment that confirmed what many already believed, that Jada Pinkett Smith occupies a unique position in celebrity culture where moral authority is exercised without equivalent vulnerability. And once an audience believes that, affection doesn't return easily.